But let's kick off with this idea of a war cabinet. I'll give you the first free hit at this, Stephen. I mean, really, who's the elbow trying to kid here? They lose the election, but let us into cabinet anyway.
Well, look, I think you're over-egging this just a tiny bit there.
Oh, come on, a Sunday night. Let's have some fun.
I think what Joel has suggested, and Albo's reiterated today, is that the drought is of such national significance that we should put aside partisan politics. And I think that's, frankly, a good idea when it comes to this drought and how to resolve it. So what he's suggesting is bringing together a group of people on that policy issue. I really don't think he was suggesting replacing the entire cabinet. However, I would have some trouble because I'm sure that that Scott Morrison would not want to see Barnaby Joyce back in any sort of decision-making process. He could tour the country and send a few text messages as policy development. And then the cracker, though, and to be fair to Joel, I think this is a step too far. Bob Katter. I've seen Bob Katter's list of demands in 2010 about what he thinks should be done to run the country, and frankly, they should never see the light of day. So I think a bipartisan sit down to talk about what can we do together, great idea. But some of those names I would struggle with.
Look, Stephen's onto something here, Kerry, isn't he? Because this is a Machiavellian plot. Imagine Barnaby Joyce, Bob Katter, Joel Fitzgibbon, I don't know, Christina Keneally, all getting together to try and sort out the drought. Give me a break.
Well, there's a couple of things that I have problems with. First of all, I'm not entirely sure what level of expertise some of the people who've been named would bring to that particular process. The second problem is, as Stephen's already pointed out, the list of demands that might come from those people is probably more than the capacity of either the government or indeed anybody in this country to deliver. So that could make for interesting and very long arguments within that so-called war cabinet. But the final thing I think is the issue here is that it is the government that has the ability to actually deliver appropriate policy and fund that policy and put it in. I think it's fantastic. Mr Albanese, if you want your guys to put ideas in, there's an opportunity. You can talk in the Parliament, you could put in position papers, you could actually go up and have a quiet chat to the Prime Minister, you know, at some stage when the Parliament is sitting, and just pass those ideas on. But I don't know that you need to formalise that process by having a war cabinet.
Yeah, I don't think, Gemma, it's always nice to talk about bipartisanship from opposition, but I mean, what Labor need to do is then approve good measures to tackle the drought. And as Kerry said, put up ideas. Maybe they ought to admit they were wrong to knock back a few dams in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that that's ever going to happen, but I tell you what we don't need is another talk fest. We don't need another... You can call it a war cabinet, you can call it whatever you want, but it's just another flippin' talk fest. It's another flog fest, if you want to call it that, Chris, because the Australian public, aren't that dumb. They don't want to, they don't want to see... They want to see, boots on ground and things actually happening. They don't want to see another configuration of a whole bunch of politicians sitting around a room and talking and no doubt disagreeing because, the spirit will be willing, but the flesh will be so weak when it comes to bipartisanship. The best thing the opposition can do is take their support to the Parliament, not obstruct any measures that are going to deliver the infrastructure that we need to drought-proof this country. But please, no more talking, no more politicians sitting around tables, public servants sitting around tables and, over muffins and coffee and deciding that and calling it a war cabinet. Please, we're not that stupid. Can
I just make a comment on your idea about the dams? Because I sat in a cabinet in I think it must have been 1994, certainly 94, 95, where we talked about putting dams into parts of New South Wales, which would have gone a long way. Wouldn't have, drought-proofed the state entirely, but would have gone a long way to improving things where they are now. And because of the peculiarities of what we needed to do, we had to actually get it through the upper house. And we were told in no uncertain terms that because of all sorts of environmental flows and other things, that it would never get through the upper house. So the best thing that could come out of this bipartisanship, and both you and Gemma have actually mentioned it, would be the Labor Party, together with the coalition in all the states that are dramatically affected by drought, agreeing where the dams should go and passing today tomorrow whatever legislation would be required to put those dams in. Because
they're designed and ready to go. There's the major dam at the top of the Hunter Valley that was rejected in New South Wales a decade or so ago. There's that
two decades ago, I'm telling you.
Yeah, the Traveston's Crossing Dam up north of the Brisbane, and there's plenty of way. Tanvi, the point here surely is this is just a stunt, isn't it? I mean, Labor wants to show empathy on the drought and show that it's on board with helping people who are drought affected, but the best it can come up with is let us work with you.
It's a poison pill, and even this idea of the war cabinet, it's like sort of inflating your title, isn't it? It's got a Churchillian air about it. This war cabinet. So, and look, I think it shows again. Albanese is in this tough position where he's just lost an election. He doesn't want to look too far to the left. And he's trying to get bipartisanship, whether it's climate change and the drought. You know, it's sort of a taboo topic, and he could easily get sidelined there. So I think it might be good for Albanese, but it's the coalition's job to govern. They don't need this war cabinet bullcrap.
Yeah. And I also think, Chris, just jumping in on what Tanvir said, I also think that you're quite right, Tanvir. I mean, Mr Albanese hasn't really had... I think perhaps he's disappointed a lot of people with his start as the opposition leader. He hasn't perhaps had the level of impact some were expecting. And if I were to be cynical, and I try not to be cynical, but let me go there for a second, it's a great thing to sort of hang your hat on and try and establish a little bit of legitimacy. I'm not saying he's not sincere in wanting to see farmers' suffering alleviated, but you know, coming full circle, it's not about politics. It's about getting stuff through Parliament that actually delivers. It's no more talking. You know,
yeah, that's a good point. I'll get Stephen's thoughts on that in just a moment. Before we do, let's just have a look at what Scott Morrison had to say in response to this proposal.
Even at a time when Australia actually was at war, there was no such war cabinet as described by the Leader of the Opposition. Those sorts of proposals are novel, but they sort of don't bear out against Australia's government experience.
Yeah, so Scott Morrison slapped it down. But, Stephen, your thoughts on this? I mean, Albo, I like Albo. I'd like to see him succeed. He hasn't really done anything to change any Labor policies yet. And he's running out of time to sort of make a decent first impression. And this is just an attempt, isn't it, to get into the media cycle and look positive.
If only Albo hadn't caused this drought, I mean, the world would be good. Look, the issue here is that, surprisingly, Scott Morrison's won the election. He's come out. He's had a great 6 months, no questions. The one area where I think he has been completely flat-footed and tin-eared is drought policy. I mean, we had the NFF come out the other day and said the government don't have a drought policy. That was just before he made another announcement. So let's be clear. The drought issue is bedeviling large areas of regional rural Australia, and the government has just been tin-eared and flat-footed. It's what happens when you put Barnaby Joyce in charge of your drought policy initiative before the election, because you don't really think you're going to win the election.
Well,
but I like Chicka's idea. I actually like Chicka's idea.
Yep.
I would call Labor's bluff. Forget the Katter and Barnaby thing. I'd say, OK, if you'll sit in a room and agree to support the following dams...
Yeah, they're all there.
List them in
Parliament tomorrow and ask Labor to support them.
Absolutely.
So I think it's absolutely the way to go.
I'd call Labor's bluff on the dams issue, because I sat in a cabinet that knocked back a dam, and it was a very, very sad day. When I say I did, the cabinet got a report from the Environment Minister.
That's what happened.
And the
Peter
Environment
Garrett,
Minister was the authority. And I thought that was a lost opportunity that day. But Cabinet actually weren't empowered. It was the Environment Minister's power to make that decision based on all of the evidence. So Chicka was right when she said all these environmental suggestions. Call Labor's bluff on a dam.
Yeah, no, that's very good advice. But I think when it comes to the drought, there's no doubt the government's struggling to keep up with community expectations. It is really hurting the country. It's hurting the economy. But I would have thought that one thing that Scott Morrison did the day he took over was draw attention to the drought. Remember, he ended up the accidental Prime Minister, and it was either the next day or the day after that, he was in the bush drawing attention to the drought and talking to Macca's Australia all over. So he's certainly been focused on it.
And without a Nakubra hat and without Aaron Williams boots. He actually wore his Sharkies cap to it.
To take up your point, though, Stephen, no, he hasn't made it rain.
Yeah.
He hasn't made it rain.
No, he's talked the talk. He hasn't walked the walk on the policy initiatives, and he's been roundly criticised by the regional rural community, the NFF, and most Australians think he hasn't done enough.
So I think there's a couple of things, though, about that. I mean, certainly they're now talking about, getting those dams and what they can do to get the dams through. And I know that's not going to solve the immediate problem. But the other thing they're talking about now is looking at whether they can actually do some infrastructure projects other than just dams in the bush to actually put more money back into people's pockets out there. Because we keep forgetting, it's not just farmers who are hurting out there, it's every small business.
But they've chucked $1 million to like 100 different communities.
Yeah, I think
they've increased some more of the allowances. I mean, they're doing a lot.
It's a tough issue, but I think drought and farmers have become this sort of taboo sort of group. Most people in the city really don't know what's going on up there. I actually think we need a bit of a shift as well, where we actually make it... I've met quite a few mothers, and patients of mine too, farmers looking for a way out. I would actually like it in part to be treated like when manufacturing declines and you're trying to retrain workers. There's very little talk about that. How do we help farmers who are 50-50 and actually want out of the industry? How do we help them get a leg up and move away?
That's a very pessimistic, but probably a realistic way to look at it.
Excellent point.
Yeah, well, let me just move on to the climate issue because Labor were voting in Parliament for a climate emergency even before they were calling for a war cabinet on the drought. And now the Australian Workers' Union has come out, one of the strongest right-wing unions. Have always been sceptical about some of the climate policies put about, and now they're suggesting what Labor should do is just match the government's Paris targets. Have a look.
The reality is that most working people did not agree with Labor's positions right across the board.
Yes, Stephen, this is obviously starting to turn into a very public debate between Labor's left and right, and the right has historically been able to carry these big policy debates. Do you think that Joel Fitzgibbon and the AWU and others might be able to have some success in winding back these overly ambitious climate or emissions reductions targets?
I don't think there's any question Labor knows it can't take the same policy into the next elections. That's the first point. Labor has acknowledged that. Albo, Mark Butler, they've made it very clear we have to reassess going into the next federal election 2.5 years away. And that, by definition, means that we have to change the targets that we set. And I think Labor has to accept the electoral maths. It can't be as forward-leaning as it has been, because when you add the Labor primary and the Green primary, the sort of pro-climate change parties together, it's 43% of the vote. 57% of Australians do not support Labor being as forward-leaning as it has been. And I think that's a very potent message, and Daniel makes that point. The National Secretary of the AWU makes that point very, very well. But I think Labor needs to have this debate. I'm not upset that they're having a public debate. I think it's good that they're kicking around what to do next. So I'm not... You can't say we've got to change our policies and go, no, everybody shut up and we'll just do it quietly in the background. We've got a
especially this time of the electoral cycle, it's exactly what Labor ought to be doing.
But let me be clear. I think Albo has made it clear that we have to change our policy. Where we finish, I'm not sure where we're going to finish yet, but there's no question Albo has made it clear that we need to change the policy as it stands today.